So this video is actually the second in a collaborative series I'm doing with WattheWut, in which we're going through SAO arc by arc to discuss it individually and as a whole. I'd subscribe to both of us or check out the linked playlist to ensure you don't miss any of it. And at least on my channel, expect videos on Phantom Bullet, Ordinal Scale, and War of Underworld. Well, What has already covered Aincrad, and will be getting to Mother's Rosario, Alicization, and his own video on War of the Underworld if everything goes well. But to get into it, one of the things I find most interesting about Alfheim Online is how it functions as a game. Not on its own merits, but rather in how it and the Fairy Dance story arc contrast Aincrad and Sword Art Online. Though they are merely the beginning of the overarching story, on their own, as the two arcs of the first season of SAO, they make up two halves of the same whole, feeding into each other and building a narrative that's more than the sum of its parts. Though they are both real-dive fantasy games, the design goals of each are fundamentally distinct. Specifically, Aincrad is meant to evoke a real world. Though it is a virtual space, the rule of death in the game leading to death in the real world brings a sense of reality that Alfheim can't, and was never meant to, emulate. Alfheim is supposed to be a game, the systems in place lending itself to an escapist, fantasy, roleplay space. In particular, how each one handles appearance sets this up from the outset. In Aincrad, the players are allowed to customize their own characters, like they would any typical game, until Kayaba revealed to them the nature of SAO, that it was a world with real consequences rather than the escape from reality its players believed it to be, announced with their appearances being reverted to their real bodies and faces, creating a virtual fantasy world populated by real people in every possible sense of the word. Alfheim, however, doesn't allow customization, nor does it use the real appearances of its players, instead using randomization. As a roleplay space, by taking away control from the player in this way, it pushes them into the shoes of the character they're playing as. After all, in reality, much of someone's appearance is the result of chance factors outside of the individual's control. So in this way, the characters in Alfheim are at once people in the world, yet people distinct from the players controlling them, creating a dissonance that firmly separates the real and the virtual. That division from real and ability to get lost in the world of Alfheim, however, isn't always ideal. Appearance is just one example of how Alfheim systematizes its world to incentivize certain ways of play. Its world is one that centers around Yggdrasil, the final dungeon that promises a reward of endless flight to one race and one race alone. As a result, races are pushed to work together, but not with the others. This rule, along with one allowing other races to be attacked in foreign villages without penalty, creates an environment where paying heed to the leadership and politics benefits the whole, and becoming a wanderer and ignoring your own faction is frowned upon. However, it's suggested that the only way to truly beat the game is by forming unity with other factions, even though the systems in place don't incentivize such, creating a dissonance. Alfheim can only be won by surpassing the systems it has put in place, following one's own desires without being caught up in overbearing rules and systems governing the whole. And in this is an important lesson, one that Kirito came to because of who he was and what he knows. An SAO survivor, even though Alfheim was designed as an escapist fantasy, something Kirito once sought from Aincrad, those 2 years changed who he was, because of both the reality of the situation and the virtual space he inhabited. Kirito's belief is that the real is inseparable from even a virtual space, and as such, he follows his own way, doing what he wants because it's true to his heart and his will, even something as small as choosing Spriggan as his race. As a gamer, it's a rather non-optimal choice. Rather than having advantages in flight or close combat, both of which Kirito would have greatly benefited from, they have bonuses in illusion magic and treasure hunting, the first of which is helpful to him exactly once, and the second of which never becomes particularly helpful. But for Kirito it doesn't matter, because Spriggans match his personal aesthetic of dark and edgy the best, he'll choose them regardless of what advantages they do or don't offer. That's what he wants, and the incentives in place don't steer him in one direction or another. The cardinal system is a tricky mistress, incentivizing one behavior only to reward those who subvert her. It's especially true in Caliber, where players who kill monsters at the behest of the ice giants risk ruin, where Kirito's group found the alternative because of Tsugaha's aesthetic preferences, instead choosing to save Tonki, and the group as a whole found victory because of Klein's personal code, one that risked them falling into what seemed like an obvious trap through game logic. It's because it's a game that the players of Alfheim didn't take Yggdrasil so seriously, but Kirito did, because though virtual, it was also real.
この世界で欲望に身を任せれば、その代償はリアルの人格へと返っていく。プレイヤーとキャラクターは一体なんだ。
Sugaha gave him an alternative, one indicative of her mindset shared by players of the game at large. It's just a game. What's possible within its systems is acceptable play. Kirito just had to kill Sugaha and ally with the salamanders, then he'd have a better chance at getting into Yggdrasil where Asuna was believed to be. But Kirito isn't the type of person to backstab comrades or leave them helpless because it suits him. It's a virtual game, but the bonds he forges through that game are very much real. Where Alfheim pushed its players to keep from forming those bonds with those from other factions, Kirito fought to keep them even if that got in the way of his journey. Once a lonely boy, it was through Aincrad that he finally found the courage and ability to live and form bonds with others. That experience in holding true to the real even in the virtual, carrying on with what he'd received from Aincrad, allowed for him to come to Alfheim with his experience and levels due to using the nerve gear to connect, though as a double-edged sword. Aincrad with its very real threat of death indeed made Alfheim seem like just a game. Kirito couldn't die, and so he belittled his opposition, but failure was still a real possibility, and one with real consequences even if his death was a virtual one. Though he had top tier skills and levels, alone he couldn't save Asuna. But those real bonds he'd made gave him the power he needed to beat the unbeaten and move on. The quest wasn't just unbeatable because of some obtuse rules, there was foul play at work, only able to be subverted by recognition of those real bonds and human desires beyond the systems in place. Because that fantasy game the players believed they inhabited was corrupt from the top down. They couldn't reach the top of the tower because of the one who was at its summit. Sugo placed himself at the top of Alfheim, not because he cared for its role as a game, but because of the privileges he was privy to in reality, and the power he could have over that reality through that which he commandeered in the game. Through the captive players he siphoned from Aincrad, he gained status through the human experimentation he enacted. As such, he was ruler of the virtual. Gaining power in the real world for it, he could easily place himself above anyone else. Asuna was his caged bird, Kirito a mere cockroach. Even his minions take the form of slimes. But this mad bid for all the power he could gain was the vestiges of something greater, the one Sugo wanted to be like. However, Sugo didn't really understand Kayaba. Though Kayaba did not truly live in the world he made, fancying himself as the final boss, he was not its god. Sugo, trying to surpass him, went far beyond those artificial protections, aiming to become untouchable. Yet that power wasn't his. He hadn't made the systems in place, merely adopted them. The power he'd gained wasn't his to truly wield. Kirito, however, did understand Kayaba. Through their battle, Kayaba came to believe in human spirit, one that could surpass mere systems and data. Kirito's ability to surpass his limits in battle with Kayaba an echo of his will to follow his own way regardless of the systems he overcame. Through understanding Kayaba better than his imitator Sugo, he was able to gain the same control over the systems Sugo had, but Kirito didn't need to place himself above Sugo, instead putting them on even ground. The same weapon, the same sense of pain, all that separated them was their strength of character, and in that, Sugo was weak, abysmally so, unable to handle the reality he'd tried to control. Having possessed all the power he could in the game, he wanted to believe Kirito was the same, strong through the games, but weak in reality, aiming to take his life. But he couldn't have been more wrong. Though smaller and physically weaker than the adult, Kirito's experiences gave him a strength Sugo never had. What was a knife to someone who'd clashed with countless weapons? A knife was small and light next to the swords Kirito was so familiar with. Once disarmed, Sugo was once again reduced to the sorry man he truly was, where Kirito was stronger than him, with or without a weapon. Following the aftermath of the Alfheim incident, the game was returned to its intended state, just a game, a place where Kirito and his friends could enjoy their very real bonds. Kirito starting from scratch as things were returned to normal. Rather than use his Aincrad appearance, he remained the Kirito of Alfheim, putting that past behind him, firmly in his memory as he moved forward with those he could continue to connect with. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons. Thanks Nitrorad, Dojo32161, Mr. Cynical, Flarbu, Maz, Gloogle, Sam Bellmeyer, Brorike, Offline But Not, Bayanort, Tengoon, and Mohammed Akeem. Thank you for watching.